Our first presenter, I believe this is the right order, is Dr. Lynn Stephen, Philip H. Knight Chair and Distinguished Professor of Arts and Sciences in the Department of Anthropology. Her research focuses on immigration and asylum, gendered violence, race, transborder, Latinx, and Mesoamerican indigenous communities in Mexico, Guatemala, and diaspora in California and the Northwest. Her current research explores access to justice for survivors of gendered violence, the impact of COVID-19 on farm worker health and well-being, and mapping Mesoamerican indigenous languages and communities in the diaspora in the U.S. Those are three really big projects undertaking at once. She has a strong commitment to research projects that produce findings accessible to the wider public, and her work includes films, websites, as well as scholarly publications. She serves as an expert witness on immigration and gendered asylum in the United States. Our next presenter, I believe, will be Dr. Adriana Miramontes Olivas, who is the curator of academic programs in Latin American and Caribbean art at the UO's Jordan Schnitzer Museum of Art. Her research focuses on La Frontera, contemporary art from the border, as well as feminicidio, social and economic violence, as seen in Feminicidios, Masculinicidios, yours has the most complicated Masculinicidios, as well as the disappeared in the Americas, as evoked in modern and contemporary art. She has published in a variety of peer-reviewed journals, including most recently at the UO's Periférica, but also the University of New Mexico's Chamizas, a journey of literary performance and visual arts of the Greater Southwest, at the University of California's Latin American and Latinx visual culture, and at the University of Pittsburgh's, this is the hardest English word, contemporaneity. Is that how you say it? Historical presence of visual culture. Her research has been presented in another series, Crimes Against Humanity in Latin America, Mexico, Center for Latin American Studies, and the University Center for International Studies, and the University of Pittsburgh. Finally, we have Gabriela Martínez, who is professor and John Anderson Chair in the School of Journalism and Communication. She is an international award-winning documentary filmmaker who has produced and directed over 15 documentary films focusing on indigenous cultures, social movements, human rights, and gender issues in different regions of the Americas, including the Andean region, Central America, Mexico, and the United States. Professor Martinez also specializes in the politicology of communication and in international and global communication. Her work aims at influencing cultural understanding, policy challenges, and social transformation. Please welcome this amazing panel of really distinguished colleagues and collaborators who we're very lucky to have here at the University of Oregon. It's the end of day, so you know.
Thank you all for coming. I want to thank CLLAS and I want to thank the museum and my amazing colleagues, Gabriela and Adriana, and the many projects and adventures that we have had and will continue to have today. So I just turn it off.
So if you turn it on, we really can't record. That's what I need. But that's how it's on.
So or change the mic, maybe.
Sure. Yeah. Let's try that.
Okay, well, I'm going to talk a talk titled Holding the Mexican and Other States Accountable to Violence, Art, and Social Movements. And you can see up there it says, Ayotzinapa fue el Estado. So that gives me a little bit of a preview of where I'm going to sort of bring together a little bit about social movements, the structure of states, and art, all in 12 minutes. Using the case studies of Ayotzinapa. So structures of violence are really, really important. And if we look at structural inequalities, collaboration between organized crime, police, military, government officials, and race and gender inequalities linked to ongoing colonialism, and weak judicial systems, that's a big stew, and it's kind of a scary one at this moment, right here. That's often where we can tie the state and its representatives to different kinds of violence. So one of the questions is, how do we make these structures visible? How do we hold the state accountable? And how can art help us, particularly in the service of social movements? This is like very text heavy, I apologize. But I wanted to just introduce a concept that's developed by Pilar Calvero and one of my good friends and colleagues, Aida Hernandez Castillo, who is publishing a book about rastreadores, groups of women who are digging up their relatives in Mexico, a disappearing device. And Calvero defines it as a specific practices, institutions, and discourse that makes possible and reproduces the disappearance of persons. And of course, we're waving to Foucault. In this concept and idea. And Calvero, this is a quote from one of her books. In the 1970s, this repressive practice of disappearances was articulated with the degraded and authoritarian population of a state that had lost its revolutionary matrix, referring to the PRI in the 21st century, and it was recycled to become one of the networks of power relations of a criminal capitalism. We have other people writing about criminal capitalism, settler capitalism, different forms of sort of savage capitalism in which the state and networks of illegality are associated for the sake of a maddening level of accumulation that has made nature, the human being, and life itself instruments of the market. And I would add disposable, right? Certain people are disposable and become disposed of. Other people, a close colleague and friend of mine, Shannon Speed, has called this neoliberal multi-criminalism, when organized crime businesses and militarization of many different kinds is integrated with a large political economy and state institutions from the national down to the local level. And now we can see that disappearance is normalized as a part of, quote, democratic, unquote, states. Mexico is a democratic state. Supposedly, we live in one too. And authoritarian states. So it's something that has evolved through time in Mexico, but has also evolved other places. Okay, just a little shout out to some of the work that Erin and I have been doing. Now, this has happened. There are more than 100,000 documented disappeared people in Mexico right now. That includes significant numbers of women. A lot of those are young men also. And Guatemala, Mexico have passed laws to criminalize feminicide, violence against women. Guatemala has specialized courts. Mexico has also reformed its court system. So the acceleration of disappearances and of the disappearance device is happening at the same time that legal reform is happening. And in Mexico, the refinement of this sort of disappearance as an instrument of terror began really in the 70s with what's called La Guerra Sucia, the dirty war of Mexico. And actually that's when women and relatives began to organize organizations, an organization named Eureka, for example, that still exists today and continues. So that's after the massacre of students in Tlatelolco. So the idea of organized groups of relatives, of mothers and other relatives looking for the disappeared has a long and deep history in Mexico. It's not something that's new. It has a long and deep history in Latin America, as you know, in Chile and El Salvador. At one point, I believe in the late 80s and 90s, there were about 25 countries in Latin America with mothers of the disappeared groups. The other point I just want to make is we, here in the United States, are connected to these disappearances in Mexico. Drug income is extremely important. In Mexico, drug sales are the most important form of foreign exchange. It exceeds petroleum, tourism, immigrant remittances, and it's been reported that Mexican cartels employ roughly 175,000 people, making them actually the 5th largest employer in the country. They control human smuggling, extortion, and they get all their guns from the U.S. And they are, of course, integrated with state structures and authorities, not just in Mexico, but also in the U.S. They have to be, because that's how they're able to conduct business. Okay, I'm going to use now, for the second part of my talk, I hope I have 6 minutes maybe, the case of the disappearance of students who were training to be teachers as a case study. Many of you probably have heard of the disappearance of the students in Ayotzinapa. The best descriptive account, I think, comes from John Gibler, so I'm just going to quickly read it. September 26, 2014, 10 years ago in September, in and around Iguala Guerrero, hundreds of municipal, state, and federal police, together with soldiers from the Mexican army and civilian members of the transnational illegal heroin export company, organized crime company, known as Guerreros Unidos, which runs buses up to Chicago and other places, collaborated on an attack. This assault involved attacking 5 commercial buses that were commandeered by 100 students from the Ayotzinapa Girls Teachers College. They were actually going to mount a protest movement. And one bus, by mistake, was also involved that was carrying a soccer team of young soccer players from the state capitol and several taxis. The attackers killed 6 people. 3 Ayotzinapa students, a bus driver, a teenage soccer player, and a taxi passenger, critically wounded many more, and forcibly disappeared 43 students. There were many investigations. There were false investigations. There were many tales told. No one has still been held accountable for these disappearances. The Inter-American Commission on Human Rights in March 22 exposed the involvement in their report of high-level government officials and institutions in the cover-up. The Mexican military's infiltration and surveillance of the Teachers College before the students came, during and after, is documented. There's manipulation of the crime scene by the Mexican Navy, forced confessions through torture. Most likely, the students had commandeered buses or one bus with drugs on it that was bound for the U.S. The search for the Ayotzinapa students amplified an already existing movement of mothers and families of the disappeared. Within months, people were finding mass graves with dozens of people in them in Guerrero, Sinaloa, and elsewhere in Mexico. It began to uncover what, had already been known, but really was raised with new attention. Often the crowds began to shout out loud. They would count, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 8, 9, 10, I won't go up to 43. In every public event and public places to make those students. I attended, I think you were there, Pedro, I can't remember, we had a couple of Ayotzinapa rallies here with the faces of the student. We had events in Eugene, and it generated just a lot of public art immediately. I've worked for a long time in Oaxaca. Actually, what you saw on the poster is from a stenciling that was done in Oaxaca in 2015. But a local artist collective known as Los Tlacolulocos, who've gotten very famous for their murals in LA. They've been in LACMA. I think they've also had an exhibit in New York. They painted, this is a large mural, referring to the 43 students. And it dominates the whole block. It says Solo Dios Perdona and many other things. Another collective that I did a lot of work, Asado, this is just a piece of it, but they did woodblock prints. They have a workshop, graphic arts workshop, and they did woodblock prints and put them in many different locations in Oaxaca. So public art was very, very important, as there were many, many ways to sort of hold the government accountable, keep the faces, the names, the families, to keep that all alive. Significant exhibit that I went to, which was very powerful and many, many people saw, was in 2019, the Chinese artist Ai Weiwei installed an exhibit at the Museo Universitario de Arte Contemporáneo, which is at the UNAM, the National Autonomous University campus, where he made portraits of each of the students out of Legos. And the portraits were accompanied by this huge timeline that wrapped around the whole museum about what happened, testimonies from human rights workers, videos. It was really an amazing multimedia installation, and also, featured human rights workers, journalists, family members. Every year in Mexico, there is a big march on the anniversary of the disappearances, and the last one I went to was in 2023. There was another one this year. And it was just very, very powerful. And I think the most powerful part for me and the last, presence that I had there was watching the families on stage. And in fact, I can't remember, I think it was 3 or 4 of the parents of the disappeared students had passed away the year before, right? Because it had been 10 years. And that was important because this group of parents and the family members, they have continued to fight, to rally, to do all kinds of things. And they're, repeating, where are they? They left us alive. We want them. And they're amazing. But that movement and all of this public art, I think is really crucial in holding states accountable that are implementing disappearing devices.
So what I'm going to discuss this afternoon is something based on what we work for the catalog. So I will be going over that a little bit. And my part in the catalog is about the making of Keep Your Eyes on Guatemala, which is a documentary that I produced between 2011 and it was released. And what I want to do with this is kind of walk you through what you will be reading in the catalog, more or less. Those are the parts in how I section the chapter that and here I want to contextualize for all of you. I know some of you may have seen the documentary when it came out almost 10 years ago already, 10, 11 years. Time flies, but I want to go through make that documentary. So it's kind of an artist's statement, right, or a scholar's statement of how we went about that work. And first, I want to say that it was a complete collaboration with the AHPN, which is the Archivo Histórico de la Policía Nacional de Guatemala. We also work with other organizations in Guatemala. But in order to get to all of that, I took a first trip in which actually Michelle came to that first trip. And we went filming parts of what it will become later the entire film. Because I had to put together a trailer, which nobody has seen the trailer because it was only for our sponsors that turned out to be, at the end, the University of Oregon, which signed an agreement with the AHPN, a mutual agreement of collaboration, which I think that has become kind of lost in the history of our work with the Archivo Histórico de la Policía Nacional de Guatemala. So I had to put together this trailer for the university and also for the NSRC, which is the Network Startup Resource Center, that probably most people haven't heard of that. But it's a center here at the university that works with digital things. And they were big sponsors of producing this film and the agreement with the AHPN. We also produce the translation of a book that is called Silence to Memory, which is the report that was produced in Guatemala in 2007. And then we translated to the only version in a different language, which is in English, that any of you can download for free, and it's sitting in our digital space in the library. So you can access that. So before I continue, I would like to play for you the trailer, which is about 4 minutes, so that you get to see how we kind of saw the idea that this is super important in terms of human rights, and that it's really important for our university to be involved with human rights across the Americas. So, ladies.
Esto nosotros, con certeza, sabemos de que el archivo de la policía tiene muchísima información con respecto a todos.
Let me know that when we are HPN, it was in 2011, by then they already had digitalized about 12 million of the documents out of that universe of 80 million. Now, what they is, because this is a historical archive, it has documents that are prior to the Civil War in Guatemala, which began in 1960 and ended in 1996 with the peace accords. So what they have done is to kind of slice a whole decade, 1975 to 90, when the dictators of that time, which were several generals, one after the other, were committing the most horrendous atrocities, including the genocide against the Ixil people, the indigenous populations of Guatemala. So basically, they were digitizing that decade of papers. My understanding is that up to date, there are about 20 million of pieces of papers digitized. When I went back to continue filming on the second trip to gather more footage, I learned through an interview with the director of GUM, which is the Grupo de X people were being disappeared. I learned that actually the first case that they ever against the former military was the one of Federico Garcia, which was, it has the number one. That was the first case, and it was actually because they went on a visit to the new open archive and they spotted one pieces of paper with a signature of a coronel, that was giving, kind of bringing up in rank to some policemen who have captured these young men and tortured and disappeared. So based on that, they opened the case, and out of that one piece of paper, they continue doing a search, and the case ended up with over, I think when I had the interview, they told me about 700 pieces of paper. By the end of the case, probably was thousands of papers that would link to that one person. And imagine that there are about 45,000 disappeared people in Guatemala. So very inconvenient for the government that archive open and to have it digitalized. Everything that is digitized is sitting at the UP Austin Digital Library, and that's why at the end you have Oregana and Castilla saying that you can access from anywhere in the world those materials. So I'm going to move on. So I'm checking my time here. I'm going to move on to discuss how I consider the article that I wrote, and these are pieces from what I wrote. Years went by, and I watch from time to time my work, or I talk to people about this particular documentary. I think a lot on what was the impact as an artist and how I'm thinking about that experience, right? And when I'm filming, like the last film that I made with Erin and Lynn, which also deals with violence, right? Gender violence. What, conceptualizing and thinking about our bodies and what we carry on us. And for scholars like us that are working with violence, right? And from a human body for our kind, right? And we try to think how our bodies pair up and react to the papers in the case of the archives. When we go through those papers, when we read that, when we live experiences of each person, that their names are there. So the papers are no longer just a document, right? It's more than that. So we are embodying that. That I discuss here, and I want to discuss with you, is also the historical memory that we carry on us, right? Like for me, as a Peruvian who grew up through a war in Peru, there is no, and when I was 15 years old, 16, hearing about, Nicaragua, about what's going on in Guatemala, what's going on in Bolivia, what's going on in all these different places, it's inevitable. I mean, I can't think of Latin America and the Americas without any of this, right? Without terrorism, without American intervention, dictatorships, and all of that. So it's like we are marked by that history, right? And because of that, I've been trying to pair that up with my work and work always in collaboration with anyone who really wants to shed light on that history and also shed light on what's happening with individuals and how those individuals are adding to the entire issues that we have in the Americas, right? And I'm close to the end. Thank you. I want to say also a little bit about, like, as I was filming, and I don't know, maybe in the Q&A also Michelle can talk about this because Michelle was with me in the first trip in the archive. I felt that los muertos siguen vivos, the dead still alive. So you are with these people working in the archive, treat each piece of paper because they are so delicate. I mean, this paper had been like sitting in urine, and I mean, it was, the way they were found was terrible, in terrible state, right? So how they treat each piece, how they clean it with this love, but at the same time, every time that I was filming through the camera, I started thinking, you know, oh my God, maybe they're cleaning and looking for the names of people they know, because this generation most likely either parents, family, friends, somebody from the previous generation who experienced the war directly. So, and many of the workers in the archive were doing that work because they wanted to find something. So, just to finish here, kind of the conclusion, and to move it to Adriana, who's going to close with broche de oro. My conclusion is that, yes, you know, like this work, this filmic work, it's not only preserving and documenting as a documentary per se, the history and the story of the archive, but at the same time, it plays a role as a necroarchivo, right? Given the politics, even today in Guatemala, the archive is practically closed because of political reasons. The director with whom we signed the MOU is living in exile out of Guatemala because he's been persecuted for the work with the archive. Ana Castilla has been also demoted and basically pushed out of her directorship of the Archive of Central America for supporting Archivo Histórico and for signing agreements with international universities, one of them being Austin, that has in-house all the digital archive. And actually the Guatemalan government, just to end, has been trying to sue Texas to close down that digital archive because they don't want this out there. So I want to leave it there. Thank you very much.
So it's a total of 17 artists who were working in diverse media, including printing, video art, installation, are also artist books, sculpture. And the dates were June 15, December the 8th. So unfortunately, the exhibition has closed. But we do have virtual tours that you can access anytime on our website. And we also have a special project called Plegaria Muda by Doris Salcedo with the same closing date of December the 8th. The exhibition received about 13,800 visitors in that short amount of time. We hosted about 7 public events and 3 private ones. And among this, we of course had a film screening with Gabriela Martínez. There were also Spanish and English tours in the galleries. We have an artist talk with Voluspa Jalpa, who visited us from Santiago, Chile, and also a gallery talk that was open to anyone. First, we also had a soup talk with contemporary artist Regina Jose Galindo, who could not join us here in Oregon, but she was talking to her students all the way from Guatemala City. Among those visitors, we welcome about 2,200 UO students who came in a variety of, in many different ways, including classes and discussions with curators. Among them, I'm citing the non-traditional visitors. So I'm removing from the list art and art historians. And so we have Identidades Hispanas, Expresiones Artísticas, Race and Gender in Latin America, Democracy, Dictatorship and Development, Introduction to Latin American Politics, Liberation Movements in Latin America, The Art and Science of Human Flourishing, and Introduction to Women and Gender Studies. And that's just a handful of classes that visited us. We also had about 100 K through 12 students who went into the galleries and talked to our exhibition interpreters. And then I have to say that our artist, Volus Bajarpa, met with several students in the Master of Fine Arts program, including Mayam, Yalda, and Allison. And she also had some informal conversations with our students in PhD Romance language, including Yubari, Miguel, and Omar. The exhibition also resulted in peer review publication. This is with UO's Periferica academic journal and Aesthetics of Resistance, Volus Bajarpa's Necroarchivos, for which I'm very thankful. So a little bit about the artists and what ties them together. And you're looking here at some of the images that will be in the catalog. Is that they all share a long-term commitment to recording the loss of life and denouncing necropolitics. They do so through a variety of strategies, including this language of contemporary art that adopts non-traditional materials such as cement, glass, ribbons, furniture, water, and declassify files. Their methodology is that these artists go to crime scenes to collect information from the site and from bodies, and also they interview survivors of street violence and war. So all of this informs their work conceptually and materially, I have to say. We have also that they are all responding to what Achille Dembe calls the necropolitics. So basically, as Lynn was telling us, deciding who is disposable and who is not, who must live and who must not. I also adopted the ideas from Guy Emerson, who talks about the necropolitics slightly different, in a way telling us that in the regime, the different agents are not responding to a sovereign, but basically they are living with violence, they are negotiating the violence and even embracing it in some cases. And so with this, we have the Necroarchivo, again, a way to denounce this kind of violence through contemporary art. Obviously, the Necroarchivos are not acting in a vacuum. They respond to a larger archival art phenomenon. I cannot get into that because of time restrictions, but basically the idea is to present a counter-narrative to create counter-memories. Again, incite questions on the necropolitics, but also encourage dialogue. So one of the main artists of the exhibition, and I'm going to focus probably on two, is Doris Salcedo. She was actually trained as a painter. But in the 1980s, she started working with cement and other found materials, such as hospital beds, furniture, including chairs and tables, as we saw in the exhibition, shoes and clothes as well, many from victims that have been disappeared. So her work is meant to convey a sense of fragmentation, dislocation, even chaos, and to subvert our expectations, reality, and show us the unpredictable, the unexpected. Salcedo said, and I quote, "All of my work has been made in the same place. I live in Colombia. Stubbornly, I have remained working in the same place. That place has consistently been described in negative terms as underdeveloped, third world, uncivilized, and brutal. But this negative history can no longer be located at a specific place. My work is derived from turmoil and civil conflict. Thus, it could come from any of the places where we find the trace of the tragic." places where it is difficult to distinguish between war and peace, where the difference between soldiers and civilians has been effaced. It is from this negative perspective that I have produced my art, driven by the obsessive need to render visible the experience of the most vulnerable and most anonymous victims of political violence. So in the exhibition, we had about 16 pairs of tables. The tables are symbolic of family dinners, celebrations, holidays. They are charged with so many memories and personal histories and experiences. But here in the exhibition, the artist denies that function, that she subverts our reality, our expectations, and they become sort of like these containers of soil, of mud, of memories as well. Because of the length of the tables, they are a symbolic reference to bodies. They are about our height. And so eventually the quantity of the tables here evoking a cemetery, a mass grave. So inviting silence and mourning certainly, but also telling us about our shared humanity, because each of the tables is a different height, a different color. So in the end, they have the same material, just like us. We're all humans. So if the Galia Muda is an inaudible cry, but it is nevertheless a grievance. However, it's an ongoing struggle between life and death. So for her project, Doris Salcedo did research on the ghettos of Los Angeles. She began her project in 2004. And she found a report that documented that about approximately 10,000 people had been victims of violence in the streets of LA. 10,000 people, young people, I have to say. There's also the necropolitics of Colombia, to which she's responding. After the internal conflict in Colombia, which has led to the disappearance of about 25,000 people and the deaths of about 220,000 just between 1958 and 2012. There has also been recruitment of children into the several insurgent groups, about 500 children since 2021. And in 2023, Human Rights Watch reported that 8 million people had been displaced since 1985, 70,000 in just 2022. So this is the necropolitics that Doris Salcedo is responding and denouncing. Yet we see here life taking place amidst a very hostile environment, which is the gallery space, the museum White Cube. So we see here notions of resistance with the grass growing strong, full of energy, full of life, exhibiting this power of life over death. So on aesthetics of resistance, I just want to briefly share with you some of the visitor responses. This is what some of the visitors wrote on the notebook that was left in the gallery. Is a search for justice that ever really over? It's an ongoing struggle, right? Somebody else said, and I can translate briefly, basically saying that this is the reality to which a lot of people have been exposed to, and that there is censorship in the media, and not a lot of attention being paid to topics such as this. So not here, not there. We cannot live without fear, without being afraid. And then another one, it is very clear the artist connects deeply with their work. By doing so, it gives a voice to those who have been silenced. So another reference to this aesthetics of resistance. And then last, of how anyone who enters has to go through the entire piece and really soak in the message, and that's beautifully done. So I want to close with that one. Again, there are other artists that are being presented in the exhibition catalog. Of time, I will stop here. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm gonna field questions for the panel, and I think I'll collect maybe 2 or 3, and then we'll respond, and then if we have time for more rounds, we'll do that. So anyone have any questions for any of our panelists? Well, I can start with a question, and then maybe we'll get other people for thinking about this. So Lynn had started us with this question about how do we make structures of violence visible? And I think that's a theme that sort of is woven through each of your presentations. And I was just wondering if each of you could just reflect on, in your own work, how you respond to that call, or how you respond to that question. I think it would be really useful for those here to think about how they can do so in their own work in various different ways. So I'll start there, and then hopefully other people will have.
So the question was, how do you make
Makes-
visible?
How do you make structures of violence visible in your own work?
Well, perhaps I can share it because,
great.
you know, we think about the museum as a platform teaching, certainly. It has become throughout the years a sort of laboratory for experimenting with ideas, methods of exchanging ideas, but it was not always that way. Right, there are scholars who have written about the museum as source during their aesthetic experience, during their viewing, but it's also a space for activism and engaging communities to create change. So, Necroarchivos is only one example of that. There are many scholars and curators trying to convert museums that historically, have served males, and a specific social class that for many time could, afford to make art and exhibit and live off, I don't know what. But, we're changing those structures and trying to make them more diverse and equitable, but also, how can we contribute to the community by highlighting the stories like this and creating platforms for more education and inspiring others to join us on the research.
I think that's great. I think a lot of the pieces of art in this exhibit actually asks the viewer to interact with the piece, whether it's, which, my students were like, it feels sacrilegious to like blow, breathe your breath, the mirrors to illuminate the obituaries, the photos from the obituaries, or walking past something that triggers music, or using facial and facial recognition. And so I think that was really powerful for my students, thinking about both sort of interacting and embodying sort of the themes of this, but also a different way of occupying the museum and thinking about art. It's not just something out there, but something that you actually interact with. So I think that was very powerfully done on this.
Okay. Well, as an anthropologist, I guess I have several answers. A lot of my work is ethnographic. So thinking about the faces of the state, right, who are police, military, state officials, doing ethnography of them, talking is one way to make visible their perspectives. But, sort of flipping that and using testimony, oral histories, people's experiences of the state and those officials in their life, often through generations, through time. And then that relates to this other kind of idea of archive, right? That a lot of human knowledge through human history has not, in fact, been written down. It is oral knowledge that's embodied. So I think that's another way to connect. And I think teaching is very important. My class was one of the classes that came here, and we did a related art project in the studio, which is, it's a codex. It's a folding book on the history of sort of racial and gender violence and colonialism. So I have the students, these were themes from a midterm project or exam, and then I went to the studio and students worked in groups, and they worked on it was actually mulberry paper because it was the cheapest. It's like the kind of paper that it's a bark, right? And it's, if you go into the library, it's in the display cases opposite the checkout desk. And some of us are going to be there tomorrow between 3 and 4 if you want to see it. But I think that for the students, I'll just say that experience of learning, seeing the exhibit, and then creating their own sort of collective art piece that actually goes through many hundreds of years of history and colonialism was a very powerful experience. Not to mention, I think we did it right after the election.
Yeah.
I believe it's gonna be there for 4 weeks. And one of the students, Michelle Martinez, worked with Randy. Yeah. Very, to put it up, it has the books that we read, like all the books that we read. It has quotes from the students, and then it's I don't know, it's like 24.
That's wonderful. I think Lynn, one thing that comes out of that, your response is that it is a form of symbolic violence to deny, to not recognize the expertise of people who have lived through different realities. And I think you've always done in your career, I think I've really admired, is that you've really taken that expertise really seriously and thought about ways that you use privilege to really space to stepping back and sort of really showing the expertise of people who have lived these realities. And I think that's a really powerful way to show, sort of speak back to that symbolic violence.
Yeah, I want to say that I went to return a book yesterday and I saw and I oh wow, it's interesting. So if you can go home. So for me, I guess in my area is I'm always asking what kind of projects do I want to get involved in, and with whom do I want to work? What are their ethics? What are the type of research they are doing? That's one. The other is that I'm constantly asking myself as I do my own research and as I start filming, who's this story about? Who's telling this story? And what is really this story that I want to tell? Because in any topic, you can find multiplicity of stories. And it depends how you frame this story. You can say one thing or say something completely different, right? So that's something that I think deeply to bring and shed light on any issues of violence or any other harsh topics. I guess the other thing that it's important for me, it's how do I work with the people that are gifting me their stories and opening up to me, in some cases, to discuss things that they may not be talking to anyone else, or that they are embarrassed, or they are afraid. They have to think about their own life. So, how do I work with them, and what is the relationship that I establish with them? And being also seeing myself as the mediator, right? How I'm going to translate and interpret that story for you, for the audience. And then I don't think too much about the didactic aspect of what a documentary is going to end up being for some people, because most of my work, I conceptualize it to be used in classrooms and to be used for, especially for the students, right? Like the older generations. I don't think too much about, I want to make this film to go to this festival circuit, right? Like I'm kind of opposed to that with my work. I'm thinking, what do I want to give to students or to the next generation or to people in this place with me and experience what I am experiencing? Yeah.
Thank you for doing the research that we do. I personally think it's very important to know about this. So my question is, does this type of project or research pose any danger to you?
I think at different points in time, a lot of it, what Gabriela said about how she begins a project, I would say ditto. So most of my research, except my dissertation, which was a very long time, was conceptualized with organizations or communities, and many recent projects, not all of them, but were requested. So being in a relationship where you have a mutual stake with an organization or a community is really critical to both safety for them and safety for you. Because having a foreigner, and there are dangerous projects right here in the U.S. Let me say that also. And I'm increasingly thinking constantly about the safety of people I'm working with right here in Oregon and organizations. So I think it's important for us to see that that's a question wherever we are, right? But you're positioning. So I think that knowing who you're working with, trust, you having their trust, being extremely cautious about who you talk to and how, because context changed. What might look like a really, not so dicey situation a year later, 2 years later, or when you're not there. So I have been in a few situations, with gunfire and things like that, and I hope never to be those situations again. But interestingly, it was more dangerous to do work on human rights organizations, which I did in El Salvador in the 90s with the comadres. It was more dangerous after the Civil War ended in many ways than the tail end of the war because of what happened afterwards. So I think
one more thing that I would add to that, it's something that we call in film like scouting. Like you need to know where you're going when you're doing this kind of work. And do your research, like you really need to know what's going on in the country. Don't get to the country or to any place, even if you go here anywhere, like Eastern Oregon to do something. You need to know what's going on there, what are the politics of that moment, and how that may impact the work.
and language.
In language,
Yeah, speaking Spanish, speaking indigenous languages, or working closely with people who speak the languages that is going on.
and I would say one more thing that I don't know, I think as a documentary filmmaker, that comes with years of experience, probably I wouldn't know this when I was in my 20s, right? But I'm like really more older. I'm now, it's that you learn to read bodies, the bodies of people, you get body language, right? Like you really learn to, you are very observant. Filmmaking, especially documentary, you have to be a great observer of human nature.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that, like studying social movements. So I did a lot of work in Chiapas, Mexico, in Oaxaca during the conflict, other places. You have to know how to read crowds as well, and you have to know how to watch who's watching you and watching other people. So the same, scouting, reading bodies, reading crowds, and looking, people do, when people are engaged in what could be a confrontation situation, they always plan an exit. Always.
I guess project that in most countries.
Yeah.
It's worse than it is here as far as danger. I come from Los Angeles, knew where not to go, especially because I grew up in the time where the gang very, anywhere in it's pretty dangerous. But it's very interesting to find out or to know your experiences.
So, yeah.
Yeah.
this particular case, in Necroarchivos, we have 3 cases. The jewelry has been made with glass recovered from a street violence. So, talking about other agents that are more powerful and more that create more fear than the state, like drug users, etc. Right? You know, that kind of violence is ubiquitous in the country for so many reasons, and we don't have to get into all of that. But she and her team go to those scenes where there has been a crime. And so the glass that we see here in the jewelry is recovered from those crime scenes. And then, of course, she uses other materials such as gold, etc. So that's, I think, one example is to follow in terms of how she's responding to state violence. Yeah.
What's the form? I can't really tell.
It's a talking also about how wealth is interrelated in creating all this violence. And Lynn, I think, touched on that when she was giving us the statistics of how many people, organizations, and how the state agents very much participate in this. Otherwise, that would not.
Yeah, I've heard
For varias corridas.
Correctly.
Yeah. Around that. Even Santa Muerte, you know, like we reclaim religious icons that have been claimed by cartels or organized violence, and also the police who were with them. You know, so I think there's a way that a lot of like cultural symbols, I mean, in tattoos or in stenciling or stuff on you know, like are also being re-signaled in the direction that you're, I think, asking about.
I think if I recall well, there was a documentary that came 5 or 7 years ago on narcocultura that you could look at and see. I think they focused more on music, but there was several other things on narcocultura.
Other questions and comments?
I'm just curious, are there any particular moments or experiences in your life that led you to the type of research and work that you do now that like has driven your passion in your career? Like any particular moments or experiences you remember from when you first started your career that helped you develop this passion?
Well, I think for me, as I mentioned, is growing up in a country that was at war, or whatever you want to call it. Some people don't like using that terminology for Peru in particular, but I think we were at war with the Shining Path in the state, and many of us cut in between. So for me, that was led me to want to do this kind of work. Seeing my country crumbling down. I was 15 when the war began. So my first film, it was when I was 21, which had nothing to do with this. It was kind of a docu-fiction, completely different. But also with a character, El Pistaco, which at the time of the war in the 1980s was considered a character like some people saw it as a line with the military, and some people saw it as a line with the Shining Path, right? But it's a character that comes from, 16th century. There are many articles about it by anthropologists and historians and ecologists. But then when I was 21 is when I started filming parts of the war and going to war zones, to zonas liberadas, as they call it, like liberated zones. And start filming that. Yeah, I think that for me, that was the moment.
Well, when I was very young, there was the Vietnam War in the U.S. My parents and my mother, God rest her soul, was very active. She worked with United Farm Workers. So I went to a lot of marches and boycotts. I went to a lot of civil rights marches in Chicago. And the Vietnam War was very present. There was a lot of protests. People were dying on TV. You saw American soldiers who were killing other people. I mean, there were a lot of images when I was young. When I was in high school, I worked on the high school newspaper and covered protests and, really did sort of feature stories where I loved to, that's why I first found I liked to interview people, when I was like 15, 16. And I'm actually still in touch with those friends who were on the high school paper and some of our professors who supported us in Chicago. And everyone's involved in writing. It's really interesting.
So I think the writing, like that kind of experience at a young age and the social movement and the violence in this country, you know, also were.
Well, we talked about these videos briefly, but I grew up in Ciudad Juarez. It was in the 1990s when we started seeing an increase in feminicidios. You know, it was something that even though I was going to what is here, what's before high school? Middle school. I was going to middle school, and yet my parents made me very much aware of violence taking place in the city, and you know, never to be alone in the city, never. They would comment on what was happening. Homicidios not stop; they continue, just like the juvenicidios and the masculinicidios. So we didn't really join a lot of protests like Lynn. So many activists in Mexico go missing, go disappear. There's fear in my family, and we're very lucky that no one has disappeared. But I guess this is a way for me to raise my voice and denounce what has happened to others.
That's so awesome. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for attending.
Yeah.
Thank you.